Hi there, my name is Jack Wallen, and I'm here again with another Linux 101. Woohoo, I used two hands for the number. I don't know what that means. So, there's GNOME place like GNOME. I'm sure you haven't heard that before, right? Of course you have. You've been around Linux long enough to know all the tricks of the trade. What is GNOME? Well, it stands for GNU Object Modeling Environment. And it is a desktop environment that has been around for quite some time. So much so that I remember way back around, was it 1999 or 2000, that I started using GNOME at version number 1. In fact, I helped beta test GNOME in the early stages. And let me tell you, from where I was coming on the Linux side of things, GNOME was exciting. It was really, really exciting because all of a sudden you had a desktop, a Linux desktop, that looked like it could be the one to take over the world. And it was really easy to use, and it was incredibly configurable. I remember the first time, and this was so exciting, I remember two things. The first thing was when they finally made it possible to resize the GNOME panel at the bottom, because it used to be a bottom panel, and that was it at first. But it spread all the way across the desktop like Windows. So I remember when they finally came out with a configuration option where you could shrink it so it was more like a dock. And I thought, oh, this is so cool. And then at some point, I don't remember when it was, but they enabled some transparency. Yeah. Now, this was, back in the early days when transparency was a little bit primitive. But if you remember, I have spoken about my early days with AfterStep. And at one point, I had an entirely transparent AfterStep desktop. That doesn't mean it wasn't completely transparent. There were still title bars, or window bars and things like that, but everything else, menus and even some of the windows, app windows, were somewhat transparent. It was so groovy. And then GNOME came out, and I think GNOME was one of the first bits of software that opened people's eyes to what Linux was capable of. Because prior to that, all of the UIs were fairly either rudimentary or really old school, like CDE, Common Desktop Environment. That was FVWM 95 was the first one I ever used, and it was, even back then, it was like, well, okay, it's kind of ugly, but it works. Still Linux works, but it was when GNOME came out that it was like, yeah, now we're talking. So that was GNOME 1, and then when GNOME 2 arrived, that really made a big difference. All of a sudden, it was a bottom panel and a top panel. I'm sure you've probably seen images of what GNOME used to look like. Well, you can. There are distributions where you can actually use a fork of the GNOME 2 desktop instead of GNOME Shell 3, which is what we have today. Now, here's the thing. GNOME 2 was great. It was great. It really was. It was fairly flexible. You could really kind of make it do what you wanted it to do. It was very easy to theme, all sorts of stuff. And then GNOME 3 came out, aka GNOME Shell. And, well, let's just say the community didn't really welcome it with open arms. And it wasn't because of what the designers had done and developers had done. It was just that it was so radically different. And you know how people are with change. A lot of people don't like change. And even though GNOME 3 was, I believe, this is my opinion here, of course, I believe GNOME 3 was far superior to GNOME 2. People didn't like it. And now, when the very first moment that I experienced GNOME 3, my first thought was, this is an efficient desktop. And it really is. And one of the greatest things about it is it gets out of your way. And I think that was kind of the intention of the developers when they came up with GNOME 3. They probably thought, let's make a desktop that makes you feel like you're not working on a desktop, right? Let's throw away the usual metaphor for desktops because they're all played out. And let's try something new. And we think we've got something that people will really like. Well, they didn't like it at first. And to this day, there are people that still refuse to use GNOME because it's so different. Well, there are other reasons. A lot of people don't like GNOME 3 because they see it as inflexible. Well, I don't agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Yes, if you look in system settings or settings or whatever you want to call it, and GNOME tweaks, you'll find that there isn't a whole lot you can do with it. It's pretty much locked in the way it is. Yeah, you can theme it, and you know there are a few other little things. You can remove the desktop icons, add favorites to the dash, whatever. But here's the thing, and I firmly believe that you can't judge GNOME without this thing. And this thing is called GNOME extensions. And GNOME extensions are what elevate GNOME, I believe, to the top of the heap. Because with GNOME extensions, the cool thing about this is, with the help of GNOME extensions, you can make your GNOME exactly what you want. There are extensions for just about everything, like dash to dock, which essentially takes the dash. Let me tell you what the components of GNOME are. So if you just look at the desktop, right, the plain old vanilla bland GNOME desktop, what you'll see is a top bar. And on the top bar, you'll see an icon, or in some cases, it'll say like applications and workspaces. If you click on applications, you see two things. One, you see the application overview, which is a grid of all your applications that are installed. And you can search for whatever you want and all that. And on the left side, there's also called the dash. And the dash is essentially a plank or a dock that hides itself, but you can add favorites to it. So when you click on the application overview, you've got the dash, you've got your favorites added to it, and if you want to add favorites, you just right-click an icon and click Add to Dash or Add to Favorites. I think it's Add to Favorites, and it'll add that. So you can click Applications and then click the launcher on the dash to open the application, or you can just open the application overview, find the application you want, and click on it. Now, here's the thing. One of the reasons why a lot of people don't like that is because it's an extra click. To get to the dash, you've got to first click the application button, or usually there's a keyboard shortcut like the super key will open up the application overview. So it's one extra click to get to the dash, right? Okay, so there's another thing, which is the workspaces overview. Click on that and all your workspaces will open up. What are workspaces? Well, this is a feature that Linux has had for a very, very long time. As far as I can remember, Linux has always had this feature. Essentially, it's a virtual workspace. So you have your desktop, right? If you click the workspace overview, it'll kind of pan out and you'll see one pane with your open applications. And then you'll see, I think by default in GNOME, there are two panes up top. One's desktop 1, one's desktop 2. You can essentially open up whatever applications you want on desktop 1, open whatever you want on desktop 2, and then move back and forth between them. One of the things I like to do sometimes when I'm getting really busy is I will open all of my productivity applications on desktop 1, and I'll open up everything else on desktop 2. So my desktop doesn't get terribly cluttered that way. Okay, let's go back to GNOME extensions. So For example, there's one GNOME extension called Dash to Dock. You add that extension, and what it does is take that dash and move it down to the bottom as a regular dock. So you don't have to have that extra click, right? Cool, huh? Yeah, sure, awesome. Dash to Dock, that's a great one. There's Blur My Shell, which adds a nice elegant blur, like when you open the application workspace or our overview or workspace overview. And I'm trying to think of the other extensions that I use. There are quite a few of them, and I'm drawing a blank right now. But there are, if you go to the GNOME, you have to Google it. I don't know the URL of the site right offhand, but if you Google or DuckDuckGo, the so I use a tablet as a monitor, and it's an Android tablet, and I just said Google, and all of a sudden Gemini popped up. So let's click that. There we go. Technology, right? Where was I? I'm sure I was talking about extensions at some point. Yeah, if you Google GNOME extensions, it'll take you. You can go to the website and you can search through all of the extensions that are available, and there are a ton of them. Now, I'll warn you, some of them aren't still in development. Some of them you'll probably find it's kind of useless, but some of them are really cool. And with whatever collection of GNOME extensions you decide you want to use, you can cobble together a very unique and wholly you desktop. The desktop that you want and need, just by way of those extensions. And they're really easy to install. Now, here's the thing. I've said here's the thing too many times. Strike that. Listen up. To install GNOME extensions, you should use Firefox, because if you try to use a Chrome-based browser, I think it will throw an error and it won't install them. And I also suggest that you install the GNOME extensions app. I think it's an app. We'll have to search for it, because what that does, usually when you install extensions, if you go back to the GNOME extensions website, you will see a listing of My Extensions, and you can click on that and you can go through and see all the extensions you've installed. And you can also configure some of them. If they have configuration options, you can enable, disable them, whatever. But if you add the GNOME extensions application, you don't have to go back to the website to manage those extensions. You can open up the extensions app, have it check for upgrades, configure your extensions, disable, enable, whatever. So I highly recommend that if you're going to go down the rabbit hole of GNOME extensions, that you definitely install the GNOME extensions app. Okay? Now, why should you use GNOME over all of the other desktops? Because there are so many desktops. Why should you use GNOME? Well, if you like a minimal desktop, if you like an uncluttered desktop, if you like a desktop without a bunch of stuff all over it, GNOME is a great option, because you can have your minimal desktop, which is what I like, and then you can click on that application overview and everything is there for you. So you go from rags to riches, essentially. And you can add only what you need by way of GNOME extensions to create a beautiful, highly functional, and efficient desktop. Now, that's not to say that GNOME is for everybody. If you prefer the traditional desktop metaphor, you know, like panel and start button and desktop clickable launchers, then GNOME's probably not for you. But if you want something modern, if you want something that is highly configurable because of extensions, if you want something that's efficient, GNOME is a great option. And I know, I've been there. I've read the comments. I have read the articles, I've seen people's opinions. I know a lot of people dislike GNOME. And that's great. You are allowed to have your opinion. And you're not wrong because it's your opinion. If you stated it as fact, you'd be wrong. If you said GNOME sucks, that's a fact. Well, it doesn't. Vacuums suck. Not vacuums in space. Well, vacuums in space suck too, I guess. But anyway, I'm getting way off topic. GNOME, I've been using GNOME for a very, very long time. And I've used desktops based on GNOME. And I've used pretty much all the other desktops. And for whatever reason, well, I know the reason, I always go back to GNOME or a GNOME-based desktop. The reason is, I like things minimal. I like things clean. At the same time, I like to have the desktop that I want and need. And GNOME gives that to me. That's not to say I can't get that same desktop from KDE Plasma or XFCE or Budgie or Pantheon, you name it. I can eventually, with enough configuration, I can get the desktop that I want from just about every desktop on the market. And I think that that is an important aspect to consider. You might hate, and hate is a very strong word, you might dislike one particular Linux desktop environment, but you have to understand that because it's Linux, most likely, with a bit of configuration, you can get that desktop that you dislike, you can get it to the point where you actually like it. And it only takes a little bit of time. I guarantee you, just try this for me, because I'm sure you can spare a few minutes time. Just as an experiment. If you don't like GNOME, do this. Download, let's go with Fedora, because Fedora offers a fairly vanilla GNOME setup. So spin up a virtual machine with VirtualBox, an instance of Fedora, the latest version of it, which I believe has GNOME, is it 48? I'm old. Facts sometimes, or information sometimes slips out of my head. Do that. Spin it up, and then log in to GNOME. You're probably going to go, yeah, it's GNOME. Now, go to GNOME extensions, search around, find the extensions that you think will help make GNOME a good desktop, like -doc, blur my shell, whatever. Take an hour or so, whatever, and see if you can get GNOME to look and feel exactly as you want it. Right? I bet you can. And I bet it'll take less time and effort than you think. And here's the cool thing. GNOME, especially on Fedora, especially on the latest iterations of Fedora, GNOME flies. It is a fast, efficient desktop environment. So even with all those extensions installed, you will probably experience something really, really performant. That's a word that the tech industry decided was going to be a thing, so they made it so. So we say performant, when what we mean is it performs well. It kicks some serious booty. So do it. See if you can do it. See how much time it takes, and see if you can get yourself to fall in love with GNOME. I bet you can. Now, you can do the same thing with other desktop environments, and I'm going to talk about those other desktop environments at some point. Probably do KDE Plasma next. But GNOME, it's not nearly as bad as you think it is. And trust me, from someone who has used GNOME since the first iteration, I have seen it evolve into something seriously impressive. And yes, there is this. I do have to say, once you get used to, because I mean, that's the truth with everything. When you migrate from one thing to another, there is a ramp up to it. There's a learning curve. There's not much of a learning curve with GNOME. But the thing is because it's such a different metaphor for the desktop, it's going to take you a little time because you are so used to taking your cursor, dragging it down to the bottom left and clicking the start menu and doing that, you know. Now you got to drag the cursor up to the top left, click applications. The application overview is essentially the start button. One really cool thing you can do with the application overview is you can search for files, right? And in some instances, with some distributions, you can even search for an application that you don't have installed, and it will show you where you can install it. I think it does that. I know it used to. I don't, you know, you get into your own habits, and once you get locked into those habits, you don't tend to veer outside of those habits unless there's a need for it. So using the desktop, I've got my routines, and here's an interesting little example, a little sidebar here. So I have gone back to a Firefox-based browser called Zen Browser. Zen Browser is super cool, super duper cool. And on my desktop, for whatever reason, the Control-T shortcut stopped opening new tabs in Zen Browser. And I know why. Somewhere I have accidentally configured the Control-T keyboard shortcut to do something else, and I haven't figured out where it is. So what I did was I switched to Shift-T for a new tab. Well, guess what? My left hand doesn't want to do that. My left hand is so used to going Control-T that Shift-T, even though it's just an inch up, it's an inch higher, just an inch, left hand, just an inch. You can do it, I promise you. But I keep hitting Control-T and like, why is there not a new tab? Oh yes, Shift-T. So I'm gonna have to go back and figure out where that Control-T keyboard shortcut was configured. But see here, that's just it. That tiny little change made a big difference for me, and not necessarily a good difference, but I can get that figured out. Or I can just get used to Shift-T. I could also migrate from Control-W to Shift-W to delete a tab if I have to, just for consistency. That's beside the point. You can make GNOME behave the way you want it, or you can get used to using GNOME. And GNOME is incredibly stable. That is one of the best things about it. It is rock freaking solid. I don't remember the last time I had a problem with GNOME. That's how good it is. So, give it a try. You may hate it, you may think you hate GNOME, but give it a try. And I promise you, you won't hate it. It may not become your all-time favorite desktop environment, but with a little bit of work, with those GNOME extensions, you can make it something special just for you. And you will then be saying, there's no place like GNOME. Thank you so very much for spending a little bit of time with me here to chat about Linux, because we all love it. I've been loving Linux for a long time. I am a long-time Linux lover. Yeah, alliteration. Love it. Thank you again. I know your time is precious. I'm going to try to stop blathering now so you can get on with your day. And I hope that you and everyone you know and love have a wonderful, wonderful day.